Part 1. He had no name. At least, no one in the village dared to call him by one. To some, he was the shadow. To others, the whisper in the dark. But everyone knew. If you heard his voice, it meant he was already near. Maria first heard the legend of the unknown when she was 10. Old Grandpa Sem, the local drunk, sat by the fire and whispered to the children a tale about something terrible living in the forest. It had no face, but it could take any form. And if you accidentally met it at night, it would come for you. The village where Maria lived was small, hidden among thick forests. Almost no one drove cars here because the roads were broken, and people were used to walking. In the evening, the streets were silent, broken only by the wind that roamed among the trees. 10 years passed. Maria grew up, moved to the city, went to university, and tried to forget about the village. But when her grandmother fell ill, she had to return. She had always loved summer holidays at her grandmother's, but this time, something felt different. Something was wrong. From the moment she arrived, she noticed that the people in the village had become even more gloomy, and the forest, which once seemed alive, now felt threatening. The first night in the old cottage, she heard a whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the sounds became clearer. When she listened closely, she realized someone was calling her name. Her heart raced. She grabbed the lantern and slowly stepped out of the room. The hallway was dark, and only the moonlight, shining through the curtains, illuminated the floor. She stood by the door, staring into the darkness. The floorboards creaked, as if someone was standing there. The next day, Maria asked her grandmother about the sounds. The old woman grew uneasy but said that it happened often here. "Don't answer him, child. If you hear it, just pretend nothing is happening," she whispered. In her eyes there was fear, real, uncontrollable fear. Maria had never seen her grandmother so terrified. But at night, Maria heard the voice again. Now it was closer, and it knew her name. She felt her hair stand on end when the sound repeated. This was not just a whisper. It was a quiet, drawn-out voice that seemed to engulf the room. Maria dared to look out the window. By the edge of the forest stood a silhouette. Its face was blurred, like a shadow in the light of the lantern. It didn't move, but she felt it was looking directly at her. She thought she saw it smile, but it wasn't a human smile. It was something else. The next morning, she decided to ask the locals. Everyone she met fell silent, averting their gaze. Only Grandpa Sem bitterly smiled. "He's already chosen you, girl. And now, you can't escape." Maria didn't know what to think. Was it a joke or something serious? She decided to stay a few more days to understand what was happening, but she didn't know yet that she had made a mistake. Because when the unknown chooses someone, it never backs down. Part 2. Maria tried not to think about Grandpa Sem's words, but they wouldn't leave her mind. The whole day she spent with her grandmother, helping her around the house, but the feeling of unease never faded. She sensed that something had changed, that the air around her had thickened, as if saturated with an invisible presence. In the evening, Maria decided to take a walk to the forest. Her childhood fear of it had long passed, and now she even wanted to prove to herself that she wasn't afraid of silly legends. She grabbed a lantern and walked along the path that led to the old clearing where she used to play as a child. The trees around her stood still, as if frozen in time. The wind, which usually swayed the branches, had now fallen silent. The stillness was unnatural, and it made Maria uneasy. She reached the clearing and stopped. It was silent, too silent. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind her. Maria spun around sharply, directing the lantern into the darkness between the trees. Nothing. Maybe it was an animal? She sighed, trying to calm herself, but her heart was pounding in her chest. And then she heard it again, a whisper, quiet, barely audible, like the breath of the wind. But she couldn't make out the words. This couldn't be her imagination. Maria stepped back, her feet brushing against the soft grass, which felt wetter than it should have been. She pointed the light forward again, and for a second she thought she saw something move between the trees. "Who's there?" Her voice cracked, sounding weak. Silence. And then, a light laugh that made her blood run cold. It was close. A cold fear gripped her throat. Maria took a step back, and the ground beneath her suddenly gave way. She fell, her scream choking in her throat, her lantern rolling to the side. Maria found herself in a pit. Her hands desperately grasped at the air, trying to find support. She lifted her head, and then she saw it. At the edge of the pit stood a figure. It was tall, far too tall for a human. Its face was impossible to see. It was a shadow, without distinct features. But Maria knew that this creature was looking at her. She couldn't scream. Her voice was stuck in her throat. The figure leaned forward as if examining her. The silence became deafening. And then it spoke. The voice was soft, rustling, like a distant wind through the leaves. But the words were clear. "You've returned." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But the figure didn't disappear. It waited. And then Maria understood the worst. She wasn't here by accident. Her return wasn't a coincidence. It had been waiting for her. Part 3. Maria didn't remember how she got out of the pit. Everything felt foggy, fragmented. Her heart was pounding so fast that she didn't notice anything around her. All she remembered was how she forcefully turned her gaze away from the figure and began clawing her way up, digging her hands into the earth, breaking her nails, tearing her fingers until they bled. She ran, not stopping. Branches slapped her face. The grass tangled around her legs, but she felt no pain, only fear, raw and all-consuming. Her breath came in ragged, convulsive gasps, and in her head there was only one thought. It exists. It's not a legend. It's here. When Maria finally reached her grandmother's house, she was trembling. She slammed the door shut, locked the bolt, and recoiled, clutching her chest. Her lungs burned and her ears rang. The house was dark, only moonlight filtered through the curtains. And then she heard it, the same whisper. But now it wasn't coming from the forest. It was inside the house. Maria froze. Her eyes slowly scanned the room. Her heart was pounding in her throat. She began to back away, but at that moment, something creaked on the floor. In the dark corner stood a figure, tall, motionless. It seemed like part of the shadow, but Maria knew it was it. It had come for her. "You remember me," the voice whispered. Maria let out a muffled scream and dashed for the door, but it wouldn't open. Her hands were trembling. The key wouldn't turn. And behind her, slow, heavy footsteps. "You came back yourself." Something cold touched her shoulder, like ice, like death. She screamed, desperately tugging at the door handle, and suddenly, everything went silent. Maria spun around. The figure was gone. Only darkness and silence remained. She stood there, gasping for air. Her legs buckled, and she fell to her knees. Her head was spinning. What was that? Had she gone insane? Her grandmother appeared on the stairs, holding a lamp in her hands. Her face was wrinkled with worry. "Did you see it?" she asked in a hoarse voice. Maria couldn't answer. She just nodded. Her grandmother bit her lip, as if weighing what to say. Then she sighed and sat down beside her. "Child, you need to know the truth." Her voice trembled. "You're not just seeing it. It's not just a ghost. It's connected to you." Maria stared at her grandmother. "What do you mean?" Her voice cracked. Her grandmother sighed again, heavily, as though she had carried this burden her whole life. "It all started a long time ago, with you and with your mother." Part 4. Maria couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her heart was racing and cold sweat was forming on her forehead. She looked at her grandmother, who sat beside her, hunched under the weight of her memories. "What do you mean?" Maria's voice trembled. Her grandmother slowly ran her hand across the table, as though searching for the right words. "This creature, it didn't come here by accident. It was here before you were born. Your mother was the first to see it." Maria shuddered. "My mother?" She couldn't comprehend it. "But Mom never told me anything." "Because she was afraid," her grandmother sighed. "Once when she was young, she came back here just like you did. She saw it. She felt it. But she managed to escape. I thought it was over, but it was waiting." Maria closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts. Her mother had seen this creature? But if it had been after her mother, why was it here now with her? What does it want from me?" she whispered. Her grandmother looked her straight in the eyes. There was something more than just fear in her gaze. There was guilt. "It lives between worlds, child. It attaches to people, but not everyone. Only those who—" Her voice faltered, and she closed her eyes before continuing. "Who belong to it?" Maria recoiled. "What?" Her grandmother nodded. "Your mother. She made a mistake. She made a deal. She didn't know what she was doing. But deals with it don't just end." Maria felt a chill run through her body. Everything suddenly clicked into place. Why she had seen this creature. Why it knew her name. Why it was waiting. "So, what do I do?" She grabbed her grandmother's hand. "How can I stop it?" Her grandmother sighed heavily. "There's only one way, but it's dangerous, and you have to be ready." Maria nodded, though terror was storming in her chest. "Tell me." Her grandmother looked at her as if it were for the last time. "You have to face it and find out what it really wants." Maria felt her legs give way. She had to face this creature, but she had no choice. It wouldn't back down, and she knew. The next night, it would come again. Part 5. Maria sat on the ground, breathing in the air that had suddenly become light and clean, without the oppressive pressure she had felt before. The light from the pendant slowly faded, and she held it in her hands, looking at it as if it were the last memory of her mother. She understood that her mother had her reasons for making the deal, but Maria had decided not to repeat her mistakes. She had made her choice, and now that burden was no longer hers. Maria stood up, slowly turning toward the house. The forest seemed less threatening, although the darkness still surrounded her. Her steps were now confident, and her heart no longer pounded in her chest from fear. She was free. But that night, she had also become someone different. When she returned to the house, her grandmother was already waiting by the door. Her face didn't show surprise or fear, only sorrow, as if she knew this moment was inevitable. Maria quietly nodded. "You did the right thing," her grandmother whispered, placing a hand on her shoulder. Maria didn't say anything. She understood now that she didn't have to follow anyone else's path. She had walked her own, and although it had been frightening, she was ready for new beginnings. She was ready to live without fear, without the shadows of the past. The pendant was still in her hands, and it was no longer a burden. Now it was a symbol of her strength, her ability to stand up for her freedom. The night once again enveloped the house, but now, without the heavy feeling it had carried before. All the sounds seemed normal again. She began to feel calm, no longer feeling the gaze that had haunted her. The shadow was gone, and Maria was free.